All right. So today we're going to be talking about UI in React, as in the actual sort of like building the user interface bits. And so we've learned how to make them interactive with use effect and use state and props and components. And now we're circling back a bit to CSS. Though, as we'll see, it's going to touch and integrate with a lot of other React things. Um, And the good news is there's a lot of like libraries that we can use for the heavy lifting of UI design. Um, some libraries offer complete React components like buttons and so on with UI behavior and styling. Other libraries offer sort of CSS utility classes. And so we're going to start today by looking at Tailwind, which is more of a CSS utility library. And then in the second half, we're going to look at Bootstrap, which has been around for a long time, which is more of a CSS component library. And with each of them, with Tailwind, we'll learn how to set it up. We'll learn how to do basic styling of text. We'll see a little bit of Flexbox, and we'll see layout, margin, padding, etc. And if we have time, we'll also check out some media breakpoints and pseudo classes. And I think we talked a little bit about media breakpoints on Friday. Does that term ring a bell for folks? And someone just remind me what is a media breakpoint?
I think I remember it was about like the screen size, where you set kind of limits, like if the width is this, have the program do this so it's mobile responsive, your
Yeah,
program.
exactly. That was awesome, Jason. You hit the nail on the head. And then what about pseudo classes, which I feel like is always this overcomplicated term.
That's like
So
hover and stuff, right?
yeah,
Say that again.
It's like hover.
Exactly. It's like hover. It's stuff where it's like, I think it's called a pseudo class because it's like it gets applied for a little while, like when we hover over something. Like if I hover over this pops up, right? That's a pseudo class. And we'll see how to do that with Tailwind. When we get into Bootstrap, we're going to mainly sort of be doing a tour of Bootstrap UI components, and we might spend a little time on the Bootstrap grid, which is super useful. And we're also going to learn how to set it up. And just to show you both, to show you all both of these and kind of like the differences between them, let's take a quick look at Bootstrap. So Bootstrap was created by Twitter at least a decade ago and has been around for ages. It's available as a plain CSS library as well, though it has a lot of JavaScript. So you can use it with frameworks other than React, but they've also built a version of it that has React components. And if we take a look here, first of all, their docs are kind of incredible because the docs are interactive and let you add stuff in. And this is what we sort of mean by when we say components, because we can see here that this is a React component that we've imported from the React Bootstrap library. We can see that, in fact, there's a lot of different components here. There's the accordion component, an item component, a header, and a body. So there's a lot of moving parts, right? But then all of a sudden, I get this really nice, slick UI component that's a React component that I can have my other React code interact with. And they have it for buttons and different kinds of button types and button groups. Something called a carousel, which is quite nice, where there's all these items in the carousel and you could like go through them. They have it for a nav bar, where again, we can change whatever we want about this nav bar. And then they have their grid, which we'll talk about later. And then they also have stuff like spinners and progress bars and things like that. Um, so as you can see, Bootstrap is super powerful. And there's other UI libraries out there as well, but Bootstrap has been around for ages, so it's sort of a good default starting point. And also a bit heavyweight. And so this is what we mean when we're talking about like a component library, right? There's really, when you use Bootstrap, you have to take the time to look through all the different components and read the docs and see how they behave. And then we can customize them a ton, but we're really working with these pre-made components. And you can actually set like color themes and stuff with Bootstrap, but to a large degree, a lot of the style is fixed. And does anyone have any questions sort of about this big picture look at Bootstrap and this idea of a UI component library? And by the way, anyone like used Bootstrap or a similar library before? I see a quick show of hands. Anyone used a non-Bootstrap library?
I've used shadcn before.
Yeah, shadcn I have not used professionally, but I've seen other students use it and it looks kind of amazing, to be completely honest. It looks like it's a bit more lightweight than Bootstrap. Um, they have some really nice examples. If we go here through components, we can see shadcn has, just like Bootstrap, it has all these other things, checkboxes, context menus, but it has a data table in here, which is pretty amazing. A date picker. Date pickers are kind of, I think, notoriously tricky to build, so this is a great thing to have. They also have a carousel. Shadcn, I think, is a great component library. Another classic component library is Material UI. And again, Material UI exists as its own CSS library, implementing this sort of Google standard called Material Design that's very much web first, mobile first. And for a while, I think Material UI was really popular, and that popularity seems to have waned a bit. Um, and it's maybe a bit more complex. I, in fact, have not really looked at Material UI in a while. The fact that they don't have a list of all the components already makes me a little more unhappy, but it's very much set up for mobile use and been used a long time. There's a lot to be said for it. Let's see if there we go. Material UI docs. And we can see their components as well, where of course they have their own button. Um, they've got a list display, and you can do nested lists and so on. So there's a number of these UI component libraries out there. The list is very, very long, but shadcn, Bootstrap, Material UI, all good starting points. Tailwind is a little different. Um, it doesn't give you full-on UI components, and it's really designed to help you write CSS, and to make your own styling. And so if I want to make my own React components, which often we want to do, whether it's my own button or my own sort of, it looks like this is some sort of sort of card or centered modal that they're building here. Tailwind is a whole bunch of CSS classes that we can use, and they're called utility classes because if you look here, it says like flex column, item center, gap, medium MD, flex row, medium gap 8, size 48, text 2XL font medium, things that like text gray 600. This is a great example here of the idea behind Tailwind, where like I know how to write some CSS to make the text be gray and set some sort of font weight. And I could write a class to do that, but Tailwind gives us a whole bunch of utility CSS classes to do that for us. And that's sort of the big change with Tailwind. And if you scroll down here, you can see that like the system they use for coloring and things like that, and to work with all the different aspects of CSS, because CSS alone is quite powerful. And you can see here they're laying out some grid, some sort of flexbox grid with a blue background, and so the idea here is, yes, we could write all this CSS on our own, but so much of this actually like follows a sort of consistent pattern that Tailwind has taken some of the headache out of doing that for us. And you can use both of these together, and people often do. So there's not really one right answer to this. And let me go ahead and lower my hand. So I'm not sure why I raised it. I can never find it here. All right, I'm just not going to worry about it. Just ignore my hand in the other, please. So we're going to start out with Tailwind, and we're going to see how to set it up and do some basic operations with it. And then we'll take a break, and then we'll take a look at Bootstrap. And I want to check into to see if folks have any questions around sort of this basic idea of Tailwind and what it's there for.
Yeah, I guess the question I have is it still possible to essentially copy it over to a CSS file, as opposed to, writing it inline?
Oh, great question. Yeah, absolutely. The same way that like you can use, I think you can use CSS classes in other CSS classes. I would actually have to double check that. Um, Let me actually say a qualified maybe. Use CSS class in another class. Yeah, right. Okay, so we can't really do this. There's some things with CSS variables and stuff that add some complexity I don't want to get into. So the short answer here is no. Um, the idea is like instead of a CSS class that has all these properties, I'm making a React div component that has all these properties that I add
Yeah.
here, and
So,
then
so,
I
so basically, you need to
bring
write
my
them in line.
component.
You need to write them in line then.
This is not inline. Um, so inline CSS here with this style. So here, I'm not applying CSS classes that already exist. I'm directly adding CSS rules. And Jason, exactly like you're saying, this we could put in its own CSS class, and in fact, we would want to.
Mhm.
Here, these CSS classes already exist in the Tailwind library, and we're applying the classes to this element.
Yeah.
So, yeah, does that make sense?
It's just the way I'm accustomed to. I don't like inline styles. I like to just put everything in the CSS file, not have it cluttered up with,
Right,
CSS code. But I guess
right.
with Tailwind, so you can't really do that.
Yeah, well, there's two things going on here. One is a little bit of personal preference on how you want to design stuff. The other is a bit of a distinction. So, like an inline style, because you're correct, there is clutter here, but these already are CSS classes. And the idea is, and we'll see this when we start building this in just a minute, but the idea is, all right, let's have some really simple utility CSS classes that we can combine together. And I think you'll see when we start to do this with React, this is actually quite powerful. It is a bit different and it does take some time getting used to. Like I did not use Tailwind a ton professionally. It didn't exist yet. And I'm still in some ways getting used to it. But even without Tailwind, when we're writing our own CSS, as your programs get more complex, you end up doing something like this anyway. Like there's actually a lot of CSS methodologies because once programs get big, CSS starts to get kind of complicated. Um, let's see if they have an example here. Yeah, this is good enough. So for a long time, there was one CSS design approach called block element modifiers, where you write different CSS classes for different purposes. Some of it might be to style a header, write a block, others to deal with an element. And then you write some CSS classes specifically to modify it, like disabled, highlighted, checked. And so you might combine these together the way you see here, where there's two CSS classes that we're using, the one to style the button, and then the one to add to the button the styling that like this is a success button. And so even writing our own CSS, we might end up with 3 or 4 different classes that we're using. And that takes some getting used to as well. And that is where, again, think maybe we've got, I don't know, 100 something files, and like this button is getting used in a lot of different places by different teams. So I don't want to just throw stuff onto the button styling that doesn't matter. Instead, let's make a different class for success, a different one for danger, and we compose our overall style together. Now, this is pretty different from inline styles. Like if you hear the term inline, it's other front-end developers are not going to think about a bunch of CSS classes, and here the attribute style is the important thing, because we're not using a CSS class here at all. We're defining our own CSS rules. And you're absolutely right. We would want we would want this in a CSS class. And there's actually performance reasons why we don't want to do this. But having a whole bunch of CSS classes that we're using, whether it's ones that we write our own, like we see as an example here, or CSS classes here where we're using ones written by Tailwind, it's totally fine in terms of performance. The approach does take a bit of getting used to. I think when you all see it with React, you'll also start to see how it actually works really nicely with React components. Does that help just break down a bit more of what's going on here and add a little context?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that helped.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, and Tailwind does throw some new stuff into the mix for sure. So on that note, let's go ahead and let's get started and let's start using Tailwind. So first, let's go ahead and let's set this sucker up and install it. Let me go ahead and just pull up my notes here and pull up the browser. So I've got 2 directories here. I'm working out of the Tailwind project directory right now. And it looks like I was cleaning this up a bit, and it looks like I forgot the closing parentheses here. So let's go ahead and fix that. And I've just gone ahead and I've ripped out all the CSS and everything. So app.css, index.css is empty. So I just went ahead, I made a new Vite project and kind of ripped out all the stuff that we don't want. So let's go ahead and install Tailwind. And as we use these libraries, it does become more and more important to read the docs and follow along. We do have the install steps in the curriculum repo in today's lesson, but I think it's a really good habit to just start reading through like the getting started docs of stuff. Because half of our job as software engineers, to be honest, is simply reading docs. But also because there's important information here and sometimes it changes. And so here using Vite, we're going to go ahead and just follow the steps here to install the Tailwind CSS library specific to Vite. Once this is done, and I can double check by going to package.json and under dependencies here, I now see Tailwind CSS Vite. And can someone remind me real quick, where did this get installed? Like what directory?
The Tailwind project?
Yes, and where inside this Tailwind project directory did this Tailwind CSS / Vite npm package get installed?
Your dependencies.
Yep, and where do those dependencies live?
Package.json.
Node modules.
Yes, both are true. We list the dependencies in package.json. Where does the actual code get installed? Inside the
In
node
node
modules.
modules.
Directory. Say that again, Tim.
I said node modules.
Yeah, exactly. Right, and this is a bit different than Python virtual environments. Like stuff gets installed inside the virtual environment directory, but it's a little unclear where the virtual environment directory is. And here, like if I actually want to, I can go here inside Tailwind CSS and poke around at all this code. We wouldn't really want to. And in fact, it's got its own package.json, but it's all there, right? Whenever I install something with npm, the actual code for that npm module gets installed inside the node modules directory. And this is a little bit of a trick question, but what does this vite config file do?
Configures how Vite runs.
Yeah, it's a good answer. And to be honest, we haven't gone into this a ton. It does a whole lot. We'll learn about sort of what's going under the hood with things later. But all this JSX syntax that makes our life easier working with React is not actual JavaScript. And so part of what Vite does under the hood is it converts this to normal JavaScript before sending it to the browser. And this configures a whole bunch of things. Vite has a plugin specifically for working with React to do that. Depending on other front-end tools we use, it goes here. And for things like importing CSS modules as well, we need to do some modifications here. And this is sort of like our control station for a whole lot of stuff. So here in this list of plugins, and I think what I'll just do for readability is we'll put each of these on a separate line. So first off, I need to import Tailwind from and then I need to use it. And the squiggly went away. The squiggly was just telling me, hey, Adam, we're not using this yet. Are you sure you need it? And so now our Vite plugin is configured. I think there's one or two more steps we have to do here. Let's also install, these may already be installed, but just to be safe, we're going to install post CSS and auto prefixer, which are CSS config tools that I don't want to get into at the moment. Yeah, there's a couple extra steps here. We have some extra steps in our curriculum repo. I'm just gonna kind of go through those. And in fact, let me just pull that up so we can see that on the side as I do this. So long story short, with front end development, especially once we've stepped into the realm of React, there's a lot of different ways to configure stuff on the front end. So I think this is some extra configuration on top of what sort of the default Tailwind docs were telling us. And
You said NPX.
yeah, NPX is used to like run an npm package from the command line. I feel like our docs here may be a bit out of date, or there may just be a bit of a difference here. Let's see how we do just following the default Tailwind ones, and then if I need to, I'll come back to that. Because this one has it pretty straightforward. So the next thing we are going to do is up here in index.css, we are going to use the CSS import statement to import Tailwind CSS. And as a friendly reminder, in this main JSX file that loads our app component, that is where we really put our whole app. We import index.css. So this is a good place to put stuff, CSS stuff that we want our whole React app to use. So by importing it here, now like all the other CSS files I'm going to be using, well, this will already be loaded. So let's give this a quick test to make sure this is working. I think I might need to add. Yeah, let's see if we're working here, or if we need to add something else. So I've got my app over here, and let's try adding a little bit of Tailwind to it and see how we do. And it looks like there is indeed a step here that's missing, and we might have to do some of these extra steps. We've got this here, but I don't think the Tailwind CSS got fully loaded if we look through stuff. Yeah, it's going to be a little hard to see what's going on here. Okay, let's try sort of the additional steps then from the install fest and see if we can get this working.
I've been using Tailwind on my React Vite projects, and I've had no issues following their, uh, I guess, directions. Like I just did it verbatim besides the HTML part, and it works fine for me.
Oh, interesting. I wonder if there's something that I'm forgetting here. Um, let's give this a quick once over then. We've got Tailwind CSS in the vconfig. We import it into index CSS. We restarted our build process. Make sure your compiled CSS is included in the head, which Vite should be doing for us, I think.
So
Um,
we'd be doing this step in index.html where it talks about put in your HTML.
I don't think that's necessary.
yeah, I don't think so either. We can take a quick look though. If we look over here, yeah, I don't think we have to add anything because we don't see it here, but the Vite dev server will load index CSS for us, right? Which is happening here. So I think then that should load Tailwind. Um, so this part we don't need to worry about because Vite dev server handles that for us with React. Um, let's just try this again real quick. Sometimes and if we look here at the CSS styles, so that should be yeah, so the tailwind is definitely not getting applied at the moment. I doubt we would need
Well,
to.
I actually used the class instructions, which is a different way to do it.
Oh, and that worked as well.
It worked, but you have to add an extra step because if you look at dependencies, Tailwind needs to be backdated to like an older Tailwind, which is Tailwind 3.4. And that's the only extra step.
Interesting.
I left the code in the comment section.
Oh, thank you. Right. And that's what we have here. And I feel like this is maybe what we need to update. And this is what we have here. And then we have to make sort of a Tailwind config.js file.
No, it actually creates a Tailwind config.js file if you install
Right.
npm Tailwind, yeah. And before that, you run npm 3 to backdate to like an earlier npm. So
Right. If possible, I would like to. especially if Noah, if you said you got it working, if possible, I would like for us to be able to be on Tailwind 4.0. But let's see if I can't get this working in a second, we can go back to the old way. I may just, to be honest, if I can't get this working, I may just, oh, there we go. Okay. Okay. So good news. My mistake here, it looks like it was relatively simple. And so let me remove some items here. Okay. I'm not sure what was going on there, but it appears that putting this import Tailwind CSS and index CSS is not sufficient. Because we can see here, if I remove it from app CSS, then it's gone. But now here it's working. And in fact, if I remove it from here, this shouldn't change anything. So I'm not sure if this is a change in how Vite and Tailwind do stuff, or if I had a misunderstanding, or there's possibly there's a config step so you don't have to do this. But at the moment, it looks like the easy answer here is if I want to use, I just want to import Tailwind CSS directly into the CSS file where I'm applying stylings. And I suspect, yeah, this may add a little complexity because we may have to do this import Tailwind at the top of every CSS file later on as we make it for different components. But for today, I think we're just going to have the one CSS file, and it shouldn't be an issue. And also, like when we take a break, I'll kind of dig into this, or during lunch, I'll dig into this and have a clear answer moving forward. We'll probably update the curriculum because it looks like this was a change from Tailwind 3 to Tailwind 4 with how you install it. So just to recap, and Morty, I really appreciate the help. I wanted to, whenever possible, you want to figure out how to make it work with the way that the sort of official docs say it should work, because that it just makes life simpler and it sort of has you be in line with how they want you to do it. So to recap here, first off, by default, we're using Tailwind version 4, which is the most recent one. And I think our curriculum is for like version 3 or 3.4. Like you were saying, Morty, you kind of had to go back to a previous version to get that approach to work. And then we can follow these install steps using Vite. And this step worked just fine. This step worked just fine. Note that in the Vite config, because we have this React plugin here, I just added Tailwind right after it. And then here was the step that I got wrong. And I assumed that we could import Tailwind into index.css, and that would work great. That did not turn out to be the case, because we're importing app.css right here with the component we're using it in. This is where I need to import Tailwind. And then that lets me start to use all the different Tailwind classes like this one to add red text. Sorry for the confusion there, but hopefully that, like, walking through the install process again was helpful. Also, just be mindful that, whenever you're changing config files, you always will need to restart the dev server. And do folks have any install related questions around Tailwind?
So if you go to main.jsx, doesn't have the index.css file.
It does. And I would have expected this to work, but it didn't. Yeah, is that what you were wondering about, Jason?
Yeah, because I would have thought if you would have put in the CSS file, it would have pretty much been good for everything throughout the project. So I'm just kind of confused about that.
Yeah. Well, this opens a bit more of a complex door. There's something called CSS modules that I think Vite is configured to use with this tool called Post CSS. Um, and CSS modules give you namespacing or scoping by file, so that if I create like a CSS class in one file, it's not accessible in another. On big projects, this is actually really, really nice. Um, I suspect that may be the issue that we're running into here, but I'm not sure. I need to do a little more digging. And that's something that's kind of set up under the hood with Vite, because I think like CSS modules are set up by default. But I need to poke around and see. To be honest, it could be something else as well. It could be a detail of how the plugins work. I doubt it, but it's possible the order of this matters. With front end tooling, it can get a little funky. But I'm with you. I thought it would work as well, but we clearly saw. Unfortunately, it did not. But thankfully, we have this workaround. During lunch, I'll figure out what the issue is, and I'll let you all know because it'll be good to see. Why don't we take a short break? Should we do like, are people good with 5? Yeah, let's take 5. And then at 10 till we'll come back and we'll actually start using Tailwind. All right, awesome. Thank you very much, folks, and I'll see you all in 5 minutes. So I was fiddling around with this a little during the break. It actually appears to be working okay now with import Tailwind here in index CSS. I'm just going to dig into it a bit more during lunch to get this sorted out. So I'm not sure if I made an error or if maybe one of the additional install steps I did resolved the initial issue. I think our curriculum is using version 3 of Tailwind, and there have been some changes between version 3 and version 4. So I will kind of dig into that and figure out what's going on. Hopefully we don't run into any version 3, version 4 issues here. There are a couple sort of like quality of life VS Code extensions that are really, really useful with Tailwind. So let's start with those real quick. So if you want, you can install this library so that we can easily see the Tailwind docs. This one I've already installed, but I highly recommend it. It will give some nice autocomplete for Tailwind in VS Code when we're using the different like Tailwind names. Or it looks like we may have to create a Tailwind config file for this one to work. I would also recommend Tailwind fold, which is if you're using Tailwind a lot, you will start to see like some very long CSS, like sets of CSS classes. So I would install Tailwind fold as well. The rest of these I think are a bit of dealer's choice. But Tailwind fold Tailwind, IntelliSense, and Tailwind docs. And as you can see here, in fact, Tailwind recommends them. Prettier is a good one to have as well. That's a little different. Let's see if we can't figure out real quick. What's happened with this Tailwind config file. Yeah, and that's the issue here, that Tailwind 4 came out in January. So I think we need to do some updating to it. And it looks like it's basically deprecated the Tailwind config file. So for the moment, let's not worry about this. If we really need to, like, as we go through this, we could always just stick with Tailwind 3.4. But I think so far with Tailwind 4, we haven't run into any like major pain points. So I think that this is still a good starting place for us, and we can see how it goes. So now that we have Tailwind up and running, though it took us a step or two, let's just kind of take a look through some of the features that it offers. And I do recommend taking a little bit of time and just reading through these docs, because I think they lay it out very well. And as you can see, they talk a lot about Tailwind's like design philosophy and why to do things this way. And we're going to sort of do a high level overview of this today. But if you want to be using Tailwind, you will have to be spending some time moving through the docs and getting comfortable with them. And as you can see, there's Tailwind settings for just about everything, right? Including Flexbox and Grid and so on. And padding and margin, which are classics. And I think that's actually a good starting point for us to talk about here with Tailwind. Yeah, I'm going to close this out just to give us a little more real estate. So as you can see, like a lot of the text manipulation properties with Tailwind, we can just write out like so. One gotcha that always gets me is if I'm adding a color, if I don't add like the weight of the color, then it doesn't get rendered. And I think that's a bit of a common gotcha. Let's add just a couple elements here and start playing with them. Let's make a button. And let me make this a little bit bigger just so we can see. And actually, let's look up. So we should be able to increase our font size here with these text LG, XL, and so on commands. So let's see how we do. And there we've made our H1 a bit bigger. Let's in fact go for maybe 6XL to make it really big. And Tailwind has done some proportioning here for us. So we can see there's sort of a relationship here, right, between the increased sizes, and it's all working off of a base font size that we can set. Let's go ahead and add some elements with some padding. And let me go ahead and make a button. And we'll just call it the click me button. And now let's use Tailwind to give it some styling. Let's give it a border of 2. I like that, but let's give it some padding around the border as well. And I'm just going to do padding left and right of 4 pixels. And let's see what this squiggly is here for. Provide an explicit type prop for button. And let's say for some reason I want to make the top and bottom padding really high. Well, now I can do that. And you know, Jason, you raised a good point before, like this ends up being a lot, right? And maybe for some reason we want the text to be green. Maybe I want the background color to be a different color. Let's see if this works here. And I've got this terribly ugly button. And yes, this does feel like a bit of a pain in the butt. Like, what if I want to have a bunch of these buttons? Well, what do I do? Well, this is where Tailwind plays really nicely with React. And I'm going to use Emmet to make a React functional component just named my button. And over here, let's grab this stuff here and let's stick it right there.
So throwing it into individual components might kind of take away some of that, you know.
Yeah,
You see it.
exactly. Exactly. And let's say that this button is going to take 2 props. It's going to take, we'll call it button label. I'm sure there's a better term here. And let's call it like just on click handler. And what we're going to do is I'll write a little wrapper function here just for fun. We'll call it handle click. And we're going to call this on click handler prop that we pass in. Sorry about that. For some reason, there we go. I don't know why the formatting doesn't want to do that. And now over here for on click, we'll pass in this handle click method that we made. And over here, instead of click me, we'll say button label. Now, there's diminishing returns here, right? This really only makes sense if we have like a particular kind of button that we know we're going to be using a whole bunch of times. If I had to do this for like every, like, if I have to add like set the button type, if I want to customize every single aspect of my button, at that point it's diminishing returns, and I probably just want to make a button element in the code and not have a component. But if we know we want like one particular kind of button, and also this is just a learning example, then this is a great way to do it. And then up here, we can import our button. And we'll have to see if I have to do any fiddling to make sure that the Tailwind CSS gets imported correctly. But my button, and let's just do onClick handler. And I'm just going to do console.log, button was clicked, and button label. Click me. And now, fingers crossed, I've got a button. And if for some reason we need many different buttons, we can do that, right? And so, Jason, you're absolutely right that like on first glance, this seems like kind of a pain in the butt, but because we can make all these little reusable components and kind of compose something bigger, this is where Tailwind kind of comes into its own, because doing this once, like per component, isn't so bad. And I just want to check in and see what questions folks have, because I've been doing a lot of talking and writing of code. So I just want to see what's on people's minds. And
If you're going to be using like, sorry, if you're going to be
no,
using
go
like
ahead.
a lot of CSS on like one like section or div or something, is it better to use Tailwind or to actually like explicitly write it in the CSS file if it's like more than, I don't know, like 10 things you're doing with it?
Yeah. It's totally fine if you have like 10 different Tailwind classes in here. That's totally how Tailwind was designed to be used. Because what ends up happening is as CSS gets big, just keeping it organized becomes a major task. I showed it to you guys briefly, but that BEM doc block element modifier, that's like a whole philosophy of how to organize your CSS. Because if we've got like 10 different people working on a big project, that's not a small thing. So part of the reason Tailwind has become so popular is because it just makes some of these decisions for us. And I think it makes pretty good decisions. But to be honest, the most important thing is simply consistency, right? Especially when you're collaborating with other people, like by far, consistency is the most important thing. So the idea is if you're using Tailwind, go as far as you can. And then, yes, if there's something that you want to do that becomes a pain, write your own CSS class and use that one instead or in conjunction. Right, because we can still write our own CSS, no sweat. In fact, let me just go to I think I'll just do my button dot CSS, and we'll do my button special. And font family, right? Let's just change it to impact and whatever all this stuff is. And up here, I can import my button.css. That's not what I wanted. There's other ways to do this. But this is, I think, a reasonable one. And I need to use the right class name. And my brain is in a bunch of different places. There we go. And now we have this terribly ugly font, right? And by the way, this is CSS modules is what enables us to make all these different little CSS files and then import them the way that we would say like a normal file. So there's some stuff going on under the hood here. But so I can combine my own CSS classes that I write with Tailwind, and in fact we should. That said, Tailwind does an awful lot here, and the idea is if the idea of using Tailwind appeals to you, you kind of want to, you know, take your time and read the docs, and if you want to do something, take the time to look up and see if Tailwind has a way to do it, right? As you all saw me doing just now, and kind of use it as far as you can. Like, let's take a look real quick at some of Tailwind's like hover attributes. And these are some of the utility classes, and Tailwind is telling us that like I can apply really anything I want for on hover or on focus. It looks like this is a text background property of, I am assuming sky is some sort of sky blue, but let's try this out on our button. And let's go ahead and do hover background sky 700. Let's also do hover underline, right? Because that would make sense when we hover over a button. So now when I hover over this button, right, the pseudo class gets applied, meaning like it's a CSS class that gets added temporarily. And we can see it's pulling from, oh man, I'm not going to try and fiddle around through here, but it is incredibly powerful to play with the CSS styles tool. By the way, I do recommend it. I do recommend just having it open as you write code. Because we can actually see the CSS rules that are getting applied and what they're saying. And I'm not sure what this layer utilities that's showing up is, to be honest. But here, this takes us to, I think these are all the default Tailwind CSS settings from the Tailwind CSS file that's been loaded. Frankly, the styles dev tool has gotten a little more complicated. And I need to refresh myself on parts of it. But over here, like this is cool because if I want to see like the actual CSS rules that are getting applied, I can go here and I can click if we have like a bunch of conflicting rules to see where it's coming from. But now I've got hovering, I've got actions when I click on a button. And in fact, there's got to be a way in Tailwind to Tailwind on hover, change mouse to pointer. And it looks like it's hiding here under interactivity and it's cursor dash pointer. And we could do this with plain CSS as well. And now that's the pointer, by the way, and there is plain old normal CSS to do this. But again, you can see how kind of if you go all in on Tailwind, it actually does a lot for you and gives you a lot of flexibility and control. Right? Because this is very nice. And we can write this as normal CSS. And to be honest, it's a little bit of dealer's choice. I will say this, Tailwind has gotten extremely popular in the front end world. And being able to put it on your resume as a skill set is a plus. So if you're at all interested, I would not hesitate to dive into Tailwind. It's not quite a standard, but it's become extremely popular. And again, it lets us do things with padding, right? We've done padding X and Y. Here's a padding X of 4, padding Y of 4. And if I want to say add margin, I can do that too. Maybe I want 16 pixels of margin everywhere. Maybe that's too much. So you have to learn the language, but once you do, it's extremely powerful. So I just want to pause and check in and see what questions folks have thus far around using Tailwind for background color, for text color, margin and padding, and all this stuff we've been playing with like hover.
So Tailwind, it seems like it's something you're gonna have to study the how do I say this? Like the
Yeah.
way all the class names are organized, because there's clearly
Yeah.
a rhyme and reason to the madness. And then it seems like once you get that kind of under wraps, you can very quickly create this styling.
Correct. And that's exactly it. And to be honest, Tailwind is still a little foreign to me because it was not existing when I did. Like I was doing tons of React front-end work professionally through like 2020 when the pandemic hit, and then I joined Zulu Platoon during the pandemic. So I keep up, but it's not the same as when you're doing it all day. And Tailwind didn't exist then, and it definitely looked Greek to me at first, and frankly, I was a little not excited about it. But the more I've used it, the more I've come to appreciate it. Because the reality is, you all have probably written enough CSS to know, like we could, let's call this like button secondary style or whatever we want to call this. And we could do, text color, red, font weight, 50, hover. Can someone remind me the normal CSS way to do hover? Oh, in fact, I think I have to do it like this, don't I?
Would it just be like a pseudo class, or I mean,
You
Call
need
the class name and then that colon hover.
yeah, so pseudo class.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I couldn't remember because I hadn't done it in a minute. And cursor, I can set the cursor to pointer. I can do text. What is it? Declaration, underline. And it looks like this is not even the right one because this needs to be color. Right? We could do everything that the Tailwind does for us in normal CSS. What ends up happening is as your programs get bigger, you just end up doing a whole lot of this, and it's the same kind of stuff, right? And then half the battle is just how do I name all of my classes consistently so that I don't have typos, and so that when I or someone else looks at this makes sense. And that's where this idea of Tailwind as like a CSS utility library came in. And Tailwind did not invent this sort of, again, the term here is composing. Like instead of one big class that does everything, we have a lot of little classes that we compose together to get the behavior we want. That CSS block element modifier or BEM strategy was used by a lot of companies for a long time, and Tailwind is sort of borrowing from that. And what we'll see is that even if we choose not to go with Tailwind and we go the route of a component library, and you can and should in fact use these together, you still end up having to really read the docs. Like the Bootstrap navbar is awesome. And part of the reason the Bootstrap navbar is awesome, by the way, is if I shrink it enough. So everyone see over here, this menu that's a little hamburger bar. And now if I pull it a little bit there, we've hit a CSS breakpoint query, and now different rules are being applied. The amazing thing about a full-on UI component library like Bootstrap is it does all this for you, but look at all the steps here to use the navbar. The navbar component, there's a container, the navbar brand, rules for toggling, what the navbar looks like when it's collapsed. There's a lot of stuff going on in here, right? And the docs are great. They explain it really well. And if we go to like, I think they're still explaining the navbar here. There's a lot of docs just on the navbar, which if we're making Amazon.com makes sense, like putting that amount of time and effort into the navbar and using it. You don't need to configure every single bit of the navbar. And in fact, here is all of the different things we can configure. But there is an awful lot to configure if we want.
Um, I,
So,
I guess I
yeah,
guess one thing I'd like to add is one thing I had to play with because I mean a while I did a project where I was using Bootstrap and the nav bar drop down menus were conflicting with the image slider, and I still had to
yeah,
go and like play with like Z indexes, to get both to work next to each other.
yeah, yeah, exactly. This was a little bit of a digression, but to go back to your point, Tim, what we're going to find more and more is that, there's a lot of tools to choose from, but no matter what the tool is, like you said, we have to invest some time to learn it. And again, the metaphor I like is, if I'm building like a dog house for my dog, I can get away with a hammer and like a saw and like drawing on a napkin. If I'm building like a house for people to live in, I need blueprints, I need a bulldozer, I need a jackhammer. If I'm building a skyscraper, I need one of those cranes that they pay you a whole lot of money to use that's super tall and that you have to, train on for 6 months before you can even get in there. And I think that analogy maps really well to the tools that we're learning now, right? The tool complexity increases, but it lets us do more powerful stuff. Um, let's take a look at Flexbox on Tailwind, because that's, I think, Flexbox is super valuable. And then we can take a break and maybe look at a little more Tailwind, but then move on to Bootstrap. How does that sound to folks? Cool. And today's assignment is just to build something really using Tailwind and or Bootstrap. So I want us to get through both of them before we switch to the assignments. So let's check out the Tailwind docs on Flexbox, both because they're going to be good to look at, and also because I'm probably going to have to reference them realistically as we build this. And see where they hide them. So as we can see here, and let me go ahead and close out some of this stuff that we don't need. Tailwind gives us a lot of utilities that we can use. We've got a flex utility class. We've got an item center class. We've got an inline flex class that flows with the text that gets bigger or smaller. And then there's CSS grid, which we'll get into in just a minute. But let's just go ahead and start building out some simple Flexbox things. And what's also worth noting here is there we go. In the docs, they have just a whole section here on Flexbox. What we'll start to see, Bootstrap does this too, is a sort of like spacing or layout system of sort of like a 64 grid or 128 grid for everything being broken up. And in fact, I'm just going to copy out what they have here because I think that will be a fun starting point for us to play with. We have all of this button stuff. But let's just bring this in and just see what this looks like. And we'll do a couple other things as well. And so our buttons are all screwed up right now. Let's add a border to each of these two. So here's, I think, one of the simplest ways to use Flexbox is just giving us a row. And I'm curious if we change this to 32. Yep, so that shrinks it in half. But note that it doesn't eat up the whole space. And because this is Flexbox, unlike, say, the margins with the buttons that are not very flexible, as I shrink or grow this, we see there's a proportion involved. And in fact, let's make another one of these, but let's just make 2 rows of 32. Right, and now we begin to see that we actually have a pretty nice grid system here. Now, if this gets too big, then it is a bit of a problem. And there's undoubtedly a way to center that with Flexbox. And actually, I think I'm probably going to pop back here and look. There's other ways we could set the row size as well, by the way. Here, they're doing it based on, I believe it's container scale. I believe it's related to screen size. We could use fractional values as well. And then we can change our flex rows with CSS breakpoints with these utility breakpoint classes like MD for medium screens and for small screens. And so in fact, let's see if we can't like fix this issue of this last one not taking up enough space and try something like MD basis. Let's see how they did it with percents. They do it as fractional. So let's try MD basis 1/2. Right? And in fact, let's make it, oh, I don't know, 2/3. And now over here, let's do that for this one as well. And in fact, and so I can combine these flexbox rules with breakpoint rules for different screen settings as things get larger. Right? And now for extremely large, it's not taking up enough space, and I could add some more breakpoints here if I want. But that gets us pretty far. So we can do more stuff with breakpoints as well. Let's make a div and let's try to do a little centering. And this is sort of going to be like a pop-up. So I do need to use some absolute positioning, and we're going to start by positioning it in the top left. But then we're going to do some flexboxing. And it's a little hard to see, but we've got this pop-up element here. Let's make it a little easier to see with text red 700, border 4. And in fact, if we use the element inspector, we see that this pop-up is actually kind of huge. Because we've given it width full and height full. And in fact, let's give it like a background of yellow. And let's see here, background. And now we have this centered pop-up that's absolutely massive because width is at 100% and height is at 100%. But if I change this to 50, or maybe, let's see, 1/2, and height to also 1/2. So we can see that, in fact, this element was never really centered, but our text was centered inside of it. And I believe that's because of this sort of absolute top left positioning stuff. And in fact, this just drops it in there, which is a bit of an issue. So really the issue that we're running into here is we don't have a proper grid. Um, like I would say the right way to do this is not with the widthful, rightful, absolute positioning, but probably some sort of relative positioning with the grid and maybe with Z index. But the truth is pop-ups are better avoided. But you can see here, like we can still combine all of these different Tailwind utility classes to get a lot of different things done. I think, let's see, we've seen that. We've seen setting a flex row. Yeah, there's so much stuff to play around with Flexbox. I don't want to get too lost in it. I think the one thing that might be useful to see is the other way of setting like basis sizes on a flex row and maybe a flex column. So I'm going to actually just comment out this div for the moment. And let's add one more row here. And so we can see that there's these sort of like default sizes, extra small, small, medium, that are based on sort of the underlying grid. Let's see, these are all medium, and let's make this one medium just for fun. And with this last one, by the way, notice how over here on the right, when our grid gets really big, we don't have this empty space. Right, and that's because these sort of built-in values of medium or extra small or say large. I think it's going to be large. Yep, there we go, LG, or in fact, extra large, are based on the sort of overall grid system and Flexbox that that Tailwind is using. And in fact, let's see. Here we go. So it looks like these are the media query breakpoints. So this is telling us default widths when these different values kick in. This is a little different than what I was doing just now, but we saw me using this earlier. this is how we can apply media query breakpoints, and we can see here Tailwind's values. 40 rem, which I believe is like relative to the view screen, or 640 pixels, and so on and so forth. And this can be useful to know when you're setting these. But if you're using Tailwind, I recommend just using the breakpoint settings here that they've come up with. These things have been tweaked a lot over time. Like Bootstrap has its default media breakpoints as well. And they generally have like good settings and values. I am curious about how they're doing it over here. With the flex values like XS and MD and medium, where they're setting those. And I think the last thing to show here, like this is quite useful, is combining a breakpoint with the flex properties. We did see me doing this a bit before, but just to kind of like demonstrate this a bit more in full, let's say once our screen gets really small, I want every single one of these things to be on its own line. And I think I'm going to use this sizing system. And let's see where they can yeah, so we can see here their sort of basis system for Flexbox, where basis they have these values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, where it's 0.25 rem, 0.5 rem, 7 rem, so on. And it looks like it's sort of like a 96 grid system, more or less. And I'm pretty sure that like small, medium, and large are part of this. That small is just getting mapped to, I don't know, basis dash 40. I do want to see if I can. Yeah, I'd have to poke around a bit more, but yeah, they sort of hint at it here. Here we see basis XS for extra small, SM for small, medium, large, and we can see that this is 20 rem or 320 pixels, 24 rem, 28 rem, 32. And I would bet $1 that this, maps nicely to their basis, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 system. So they've given us a ton of defaults here that give us a lot of control. And I realize I've been jumping around a bit, but this is like digging into something like this. Once you kind of start using it, becomes incredibly helpful because now I can kind of like start combining these things in a good way and know what's what, especially if I need to deal with mobile. And like over here, let's just add for all of these. How about small? So now when we hit the small media breakpoint, we're going to follow another rule and we're going to say basis XL. And let's see how small we have to get before we hit small. And in fact, I think the issue here is let's do small flex column. Um, yeah, the oh, we're still in small. Interesting. So we can in fact see that flex column being applied here. I think if we get big enough, this is where the flexbox rules can get a little funny. Um, there's sort of like a hierarchy of when they get applied. Let's see if we can get it small enough to force it.
Instead of messing with the dragging manually, you could inspect it and then change it in your inspector tools to be like a mobile.
Yeah, that's a good call, Tim. That's going to be way easier to look at. Thank you. So yeah, we're not quite getting what I want here. I might need to fiddle around a bit more with it to get it to work. It also depends sort of whether the breakpoint kicks in. There we see it happening. So now here, because I've used the breakpoint with row versus column, the tricky bit is figuring out if this is sort of inclusive or exclusive. Like, does it switch to column when we're at medium or when we kind of get below medium? And that's why I needed sort of to have the rule here for the larger one as well. And it looks like what's happening here is at the large size, it stays row, right? Row, 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 row. Bam, we hit that medium breakpoint, and then we switch to columns. And this is in fact how something, say, like Bootstrap's hamburger menu or other things get built, right? Um, and we can tweak around with this, but you can see how, like, if you get comfortable with Tailwind, and you can tell, like, I'm not like super comfortable with Tailwind. I'm also sort of I dove into today's lesson on the fly, so thank you for bearing with me here. But this is probably one of the nicest things. And in fact, we can see here the way Tailwind seems to be working is because I haven't, it defaults back to the column for small and extra small. So if we add small flex column and extra small flex column, and there's probably a cleaner way to do this, but I'm going to follow the first make it work, then make it right, then make it fast. And yeah, to be honest, I'm not sure why it switches back after having set that rule there. Probably because I have this. I wonder if like this small rule is forcing it to get bigger, but I'm honestly not sure. Um, and I don't want to try and debug this live any more than I have already, because this was the main thing I think to show. Right? Because this is where Flexbox becomes useful. My guess is if I remove this, it'll work, but let's see if that's the case. Yeah, so unfortunately, we still run into the same issue. So this is where spending some time with the Tailwind docs to figure out, all right, what am I missing here would help, because we got like half the battle, but not quite the whole thing. This is also where using like the element inspector to look at this stuff to see like flex direction row. Let's click on this one actually. We could see row switch to column over here, right? And then it switched back to row. And if I click here, it'll take me to the CSS rule, and it's from the utility. So there's clearly something that I'm doing wrong here. And it could be as simple as maybe SM is the wrong name. Right? Maybe I have a typo here. But as I'm debugging CSS, this is actually what I would use to look at it and figure out what's going wrong, is looking at the inspector, because we can see that for some reason it's going back to a column, which is in fact not what we want to have happen here. Right? That for some reason my flex direction for the medium gets set to a column, great. And then when we go even smaller, it's switching to row. So that's something I can debug and fix, but these are sort of the tools we have to work with to accomplish this and get this done. I realize I've been going on for a bit here. I hope this was useful. We already kind of looked at pseudo classes, and we've spent a good time talking about media queries. I'll send a link to the list of media query sizes that we found that was floating around here, because I think that's useful to see. I think we definitely should take a break now, and then we can take a look at Bootstrap after the break. There's a couple other things we can do with Tailwind that are cool. It can do a dark mode. To be honest, with Tailwind 4, I'm a little worried that I might get the implementing the dark mode wrong. So I think I'll save that to come back to maybe for the end of the lecture. So let's take a break. And I do want to just check in to see if folks have questions around any of this sort of like breakpoint flexbox stuff that we've been looking up before we break and switch gears to look at Bootstrap.
Do you think it's easier in a way to just pick one or the other? Because I could see like, Bootstrap and Tailwind like arguing with each other. That maybe it's easier just to go with one.
Yeah, that's a good question. You can use them pretty nicely. In some ways, they serve different purposes. The real question is, would you rather use a UI component library, or would you rather use CSS to kind of like build your own components, right? And a good example here, I think, is the Bootstrap accordion. Like we can build this in plain CSS, whether we use Tailwind or not. The question is, and there's not one right answer here, do you want to build your own, or do you want to use the one that exists? If you'd rather find a UI component library that has stuff already working, Bootstrap is a good starting point. If for nothing else, I think the navbar is actually pretty darn good. Because again, you can build your own, but it's actually a decent number of steps to build like a good responsive navbar for mobile. While Bootstrap does give us a lot of that out of the box. In terms of the two conflicting with each other, right? Because we can build this ourselves. It just takes a little bit of effort with Tailwind, and it's just a question of, I think, which you prefer. I think picking one to kind of focus on probably makes sense. It's good to have some familiarity with both. They're not really gonna conflict with each other, is the short answer. As long as you're not trying to like add Flexbox directly onto Bootstrap components, then I think you're gonna be mostly fine. There is a little bit of, if I'm using Bootstrap, use the Bootstrap component the Bootstrap way. Like if I want to change the color of a Bootstrap component, I probably don't want to use Tailwind to do it because Bootstrap has some way for me to do it, and that way I'm avoiding sort of causing conflicts. But maybe my Bootstrap accordion is inside some other div that I'm using Tailwind for because I want to use Tailwind for my layout, right? Or some other styling. Short answer, if you're not sure, I would just pick one to start with and focus on that one. And once you get comfortable with it, you can start bringing the other into the mix. Why don't we take, should we do 15? And then when we come back, we can dive into Bootstrap. Okay, thank you, folks. I know there are a couple twists and turns. I hope it was useful though to see how powerful Tailwind is. Also to see how powerful Flexbox is, and like Tim, you were saying, it's sort of like this is a bit of a language, and once you get used to it, it can give you a whole lot of power. I am not fluent in this language, as you can see, but you can kind of see how the more you learn it, the easier it becomes to take you where you want to go. Right. In terms of, sort of jobs and employers, like they both have their value. The expectation, frankly, for a front end role is to both be comfortable with UI libraries such as Bootstrap and be comfortable enough with plain old CSS, whether you're using Tailwind or not, that you can do, non-trivial stuff with it. So they're both relevant. Let's take 15, and then when we come back, we will take a look at Bootstrap. Thank you, folks, and I'll see you all in 15 minutes. All right, so there is one last thing I want to show folks with Tailwind, and this is not adding anything new into the mix, but it is using different things that we've done. And so the last thing I want to show with Tailwind before we wrap up and move on to Bootstrap is how we can combine Tailwind with what React does for CSS styles that are sort of interactive and dynamic. Because what I want to have happen here is I want this background to change from blue to red whenever I click the button. Or at least change the first time I click the button from blue to red, because toggle's just a little more complex. So I think, in fact, what we can do is we can make a bit of component state for background color. And I think what we'll do is we'll initially set this to blue. Or actually, I think what I want to do is background blue equals BG blue 500. Background red equals BG red 500. And then I can just do BG blue in here. And then let's see here. I need to import the use state. So we're going to import our use state. A lot of these red squigglies are from linting rules that we're not worrying about. And then the other red squigglies are because we haven't used these yet, but we are about to. So whenever I click this button, I want this to change from blue to red. But I also need to actually make sure I'm using the background color in here. And so here, we're gonna add the curlies and make this a tagged template literal, so I can stick some JavaScript inside there. And so for the moment, this shouldn't change anything. And let me hop back into our Tailwind project and run the code to make sure that I haven't broken anything. So far, so good. And this red squiggly is just VS Code telling me, hey, you should be doing something with this tagged template literal, and we are. We're going to set the background color here, right? And so now, whatever value this bit of component state has becomes the background color. And there's a couple different ways to implement this. You don't necessarily have to use state, but this is a good way to do it. In fact, though, I think I'm going to do this a little bit different. We're going to call this is blue, set is blue, and we'll set it to true. We'll put these over here, and we'll just say const background color. And now we'll use a ternary. Right. Right. And in fact, I could even do all these on one line if I wanted. I think that's really a bit more personal preference. And now, when I click here, we're going to set our is blue to the opposite of whatever its current value is, which then hopefully will turn my button red. Right, and now each of these components I can independently toggle, and we can kind of see how nicely it is to compose these Tailwind utility classes with JavaScript logic and a little bit of React component state to add all sorts of interesting kinds of interactivity, right? Because obviously we could do a whole lot more than changing the button background here. So this is the one thing that I didn't get a chance to get to in the first part of the Tailwind lecture. And I did want to show it now, because although it's not introducing anything we haven't seen, there may be some pieces here that we're using in a different way. And so I just want to check in and see if folks have questions about sort of this pattern here, because this is really useful and important. And you all will be using this pattern for a number of different things.
I do have one question,
Yeah,
actually.
absolutely.
So for line 19, how you have the brackets around the entire class name,
Yeah.
could you instead just have it highlighting, the $ in big color, since you're not changing any of the other elements, you're only concerned about the one? Or do you have to have the brackets around the entire thing?
Oh, yeah. You mean like here and here?
Yeah, brackets only around the variable that you care
Yeah,
about.
you
Yeah.
do. And that's a React thing. So really for a prop, right? Because each of these is a prop for this button component or element. Really, we can think of them as props. Um, by default in React for a prop, we need the curly brackets, right? And then if I put JavaScript in here, it gets interpreted, right?
Yeah.
If it so happens that the value of the prop is a string, well, this works just fine. But React gives us some nice syntactic shorthand where if this is like a string and it's always going to stay a string, I can just do it like this. So the reason we need the brackets here and here is because as soon as I introduce this tag template literal, that whole line is really JavaScript and it's not a string anymore, right? And React needs to be able to interpret that.
Okay, so encompassing the entire line cannot just do like the individual part of the class.
Uh, correct.
Okay.
Yeah, like you see right here, because this whole line now, I need some way to combine this string with getting the value of this, which is that returns a string. And you can do, BG color plus, right? That's one way to do it. As stuff gets longer, it just gets easier to do it this way instead. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, great question. What else is on people's minds that might be good to touch on with this before we switch gears to Bootstrap? Okay, cool. Yeah, so just to recap here, we're using a tiny bit of component state as a Boolean, basically to flip a switch. And you'll often use this pattern because it's easy to have a true or false value. And then we're using a little bit of logic. We could do this with an if statement. In this case, we're doing it with the ternary to decide what our background color should be. And then we use it here. And in this case, what we're doing to change it is the click event, but it could be anything, right? So this could have to do with API calls or anything else. All right, let's take a look at Bootstrap because we've covered a lot of ground with Tailwind. We've seen how to use Flexbox. We talked a bit about the Flexbox grid setup and the breakpoints with Tailwind. We've seen how to build a component using Tailwind. Let's sort of see what the Bootstrap way is for this. And to do this, I'm going to navigate into a different directory which is also an empty Vite project. And I do have to do a little bit of quick cleanup here. So this Tailwind project we'll ignore. And here we're just gonna get rid of all that CSS we don't want. Get rid of all of that CSS we don't want. Get rid of this React strict mode. Can someone remind me what React strict mode does and why we're getting rid of it?
Doesn't it like display everything twice so that if you're like doing a big project, it's a bit easier to find like any errors or something?
Exactly. It causes everything to render twice, which, just like you're saying, Chase, for a big project can help with debugging errors. But for us, I think can just be a bit confusing because right now I want to just, be able to write a console log like that and see it just show up once. Rather than having everything rendering twice just causes a bit more confusion right now. So with Bootstrap, we're going to cover some similar things, right? We're not going to see basic styling of text. We are going to see a bit of a tour of some Bootstrap UI components in action. We're going to see a Bootstrap grid, and we're going to actually try to make like a Pokemon card with Bootstrap and get some Pokemon data. So first we've got to set this sucker up, and there are a couple install steps here to do. And I will just pull up the curriculum guide for reference for anyone watching this video later. With Bootstrap, I don't think we're going to run into version issues the way we did with Tailwind, because Tailwind just recently, like a month or so ago, switched from version 3 to version 4. React Bootstrap is a bit more mature and stable. Bootstrap itself has been around for at least a decade. So we've got to install the React Bootstrap library. And the Bootstrap library React Bootstrap has the React components. The Bootstrap library has all of the Bootstrap CSS. And we'll give those just a sec. Once that's done, right, and I see them here, they've been added to my package.json list of dependencies. Here in main JSX, I am going to import from Bootstrap dist, which is short for distribution, CSS, bootstrap.min, which is short for minified, meaning like all the text has been made as short as possible, making it harder to read, but take up like, I don't know, maybe a kilobyte or a couple kilobytes less space, since this gets sent over the internet. And I'm putting this before index.css file so that all the Bootstrap CSS gets loaded first. So at this point, this should be all we need to do. And I'm going to spin up the dev server again. And now let's start adding some stuff. And I think the simplest and easiest place to start is with a button component. And note, by the way, Bootstrap brings in a bunch of default CSS stylings. Like if I go to app CSS, that's empty. I emptied that out along with index CSS. But if we look at our app H1 element here, unlike with Tailwind, which is more minimal and utility basis, we see that there's a whole bunch of styles applied here. That there's a bunch of styles around the H1 element. There's been some styles applied to the body as well, and that all of these come, in fact, we can see there's some margin there. That's what that yellow bit in the highlighted is. And all that is coming from Bootstrap. And in fact, if we poke around here, we could see where it comes from. Without going into it too much, Bootstrap has loaded a ton of CSS with its defaults. We can change all of this. You can kind of change the Bootstrap theme, but it does come with the default look and feel, unlike Tailwind, which is good or bad depending on what you want. So the first thing we're going to add here is a Bootstrap button. And we're importing from the React Bootstrap library, and each component is in its own file. And now let's go ahead and just use this button and just give it a message. And right off the bat, again, we can see there's a default Bootstrap style here. And let's close out our Tailwind related tabs up here. And let me unresponsive this. And we can see, and let's go look at the button component. There's a lot of different control we have. All these variants that will change how our button looks. And VS Code gives me really nice autocomplete on this. Right, so with Bootstrap, even with the button, if we're going to use it, it's worth taking the time to read about it. And in fact, there's an outline version of all these things that are a little less heavyweight in terms of styling. Where, again, as your point earlier, Jason, I probably could use Tailwind or normal CSS to like sort of hack the behavior of this button, but Bootstrap is designed where it's trying to give us options. And so when we're using the Bootstrap stuff, it makes sense to use it the Bootstrap way. And it's done all this work for us already, right? Hovering, clicking, all this sort of stuff. Um, like there's a lot more we can do in terms of tags. We can make a button be a link. Um, we can tell it if it's an input or if it's a submit button or a reset. And then our buttons even have sizes. And let me go ahead and just make one of these buttons really big. Right. And now my click me button is quite large.
So for everything you're doing, you're going to need like a whole bunch of import files from Bootstrap at the top of the screen. Because right now you're just doing button, but if you did like a whole bunch of stuff, there'll
Correct.
definitely be a whole bunch of imports.
Exactly. Just like if I was to make my own button component, I would still have to import it. Right. We're just importing these components from the Bootstrap library. And all of the normal HTML elements that a button would have, Bootstrap also has. So it is worth, reading a bit on how it expects you to use them. But so just like we would with a normal button, we can add an on-click handler. And that's how we would add like the interactivity to our button. So, and let me just pause and check in and see if folks have any questions thus far.
Can you use the self variable with Bootstrap?
Not that I'm aware of. What is self and where is it coming
Like
from?
self refers to the object itself that you're interacting with or that you're using.
Oh, that I see. Yeah, the JavaScript. Yeah, short answer is no.
Okay.
Yeah, Bootstrap has kind of hidden all of that. It wants us to interact with it through these props, whether it's like the sort of normal ones we would get if this was an actual HTML element, or the Bootstrap ones. Under the hood, there's probably some way to do it that way, but in general, with React components, we kind of want to avoid that anyway, right? Yeah. So the secret with Bootstrap is this: read a little bit of the docs for each component you're going to use. Don't read all the docs because these options are overwhelming, right? There's like full width block buttons. There's like what's the state of a button, if it's active or not, though that's actually kind of a nice one because it lets us like disable a button, right? If I want. And now over here, what I can do here is active is button active. And so right now my button's active, no sweat. If I set this to false, why did we not?
Is it active or disabled or the
Yeah,
thing?
active must be different from disabled. My apologies, folks. I kind of jumped the gun there. So here we can see this button is disabled, right? I'm actually not sure what active does. Yeah, so it looks like the active state is more to kind of indicate to the user that a button's active. Maybe it's if it's been clicked on, it will appear pressed. basically. So if we really wanted to like manually control stuff with our buttons, then active gives us another way to do that the Bootstrap way because it hooks into these other things. I was thinking of disabled.
Hey, I have to leave the lecture.
No worries, Kenny. Thank you for the heads up. Which is extremely useful. Right? It's really nice to be able to disable or enable a button depending on maybe the user hasn't filled out all the fields in the form yet, and we don't want them to hit the submit button. And let me pause and check in and see if folks have any questions around this demo of a button or with Bootstrap thus far before we move on to looking at forms and grid. Okay, cool. So we're going to build up here a bit. We're going to throw in a form. I'm going to show you guys a little bit of the grid. And then we're going to make an API call to get a Pokemon. As I said, the secret with Bootstrap is to not worry about all of the details because it can get a bit overwhelming. And just grab what you need. And in fact, what I'm looking for here that for some reason it doesn't want me to find, because Bootstrap has everything. Like it has pagination if you want to show search results. And what I'm looking for is a form. So the form, if we go all in, it can get kind of complicated. Like you can see all this stuff. There's a form group, there's a control ID, we can give it a label, we can give it a text. Somewhere in here is an actual input. So this one's a checkbox. This one's a password. There's ways to add form validation. And as you can see, the label gives us this nice information here and here. I'm just going to, and this is honestly how I would recommend starting off with this. I would just literally copy and paste their examples, but then rip out the stuff you don't need. It in fact lets I'll just put a note here. And in fact, let's just put here examples of the button component. Just so we have a little separation. And I'll clean the code up a bit later. And in fact, we'll add a little bit of a grid in a little bit. But so again, with the form, I would literally just start by copying and pasting. Because all these pieces interact a bit, and in some ways, this is the easiest way to do it. And we can just start getting rid of the things we don't need. Right now, all I want is I want to be able to get, like, say, the name or ID of a Pokemon. And when we're going to click a button, we're then going to like do something to find that Pokemon. So I only need one form field. So this second one for password, I don't need at all. I don't need this checkbox. And while this is really nice that it has this extra text here, I don't need that. The type is just going to be, I want to say text or input. I'd have to check in Bootstrap, but it definitely has different types for form controls. And we'll just say Poke defined. And I think we'll look it up by name. I think the Pokemon API lets us do that. And so now we've got this form, we've got this button, and I can type stuff in here. Bootstrap gives me nice things like keyboard controls over buttons. Like I'm tabbing through these right now. I can hit enter to get the Pokemon. We would still, I believe, use an on-click handler. We can disable a whole form if we want. I think we can use an on-submit handler, in fact, to get our Pokemon. So we're not gonna do anything yet, but let's just make a simple function. We'll just call it like handle get Pokemon. And we might as well do this here, and we'll do event default, and we'll get a Pokemon of the desired name. And I'll print that out, and I'll fix my typo here. And let's see if that code is working. And it looks like I need to grab the user input a different way, which would make sense because I haven't hooked this up to my component at all. So there's two ways to do that. There's two ways to do this. I'm wondering if there's an easy way here. I'm wondering if there's like a bootstrap way here. React Bootstrap form get input values. Okay, and it looks like Bootstrap actually does not give us a good way, and it still wants us to do the controlled component approach. So I know many of you have seen this, but I'm sure it won't hurt to go through it again. Let's make a little bit of state, and we're going to call this our Pokemon field, and we'll do set Poke field, and we'll set this to nothing. And then over here, and I'm going to tab these out for my own sanity as I read this code. We'll add an on change handler, and we'll do set Poke field, and we'll also set the value to and now here I believe we can do and let's see if this does what I want. So indeed, I can type this out, which is great. And now I just have to update this code here. and add the closing parentheses for my console log. And now I have, just like I would with a normal input field with our Bootstrap form, they called it control, but their input field used the value in onChange properties to give us a controlled input component, right? And if we take a quick look at this, we can see, and by the way, what I'm using right now is React DevTools. I highly recommend it. If you just Google React DevTools Chrome, you will find React Developer Tools, and then you can install it. And it lets you see the component tree, right? And it lets you also see for each component its props and state values. And it actually lets you change them. So it's an incredibly useful tool for, I think, for debugging and working on your React code. So we've got this, and we do want to grab the Pokemon, but it sure would be nice just to maybe organize this a bit more. So let me very briefly introduce you all to Bootstrap's grid. And we'll organize this a bit, and then we'll actually make an API call. So this is kind of similar to what we saw with Tailwind, but we use components instead of these utility classes. Bootstrap's grid works with rows and columns, and it works on a system of 12 rows. And this was just designed this way long ago by Bootstrap, like a decade ago. So the sort of default here is if we have 2 rows, so it's a little hard to see, I know, but Bootstrap will sort of divide the screen into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 rows. And this was sort of like before Flexbox even existed. This was how kind of Bootstrap CSS divided up the world and used a whole lot of hacks to make it work. And then they kind of brought it in with Flexbox. And it's actually a very useful and flexible system. And just like we saw with Tailwind, React Bootstrap has its own breakpoint settings already. And we can see here that it's got extra small, small, medium, large, extra large, and extra, extra large. And this gives us the pixel values of when these breakpoints are triggered. And these are really good. Again, this has been like refined over at least a decade. We can customize it, but I don't recommend doing it. And so React Bootstrap uses those same breakpoints for the same grid system. And we use a container, which is sort of like our Flex container, and then a row component and a column component. And as you can sort of see in this example here, you can have multiple columns within a row. It can vary. They'll auto size, but you can also add, you can set explicitly column widths so that as you shrink or grow a column or the screen, that it will, you can set the rules for the different rows and columns, how big or small they get. And this is worth going through just to kind of see all of the options that it gives you. Oh, yes, was there a question? Sorry, I think I just had some external noise in the mic. And you can see here, you can set these numbers like small 8, small 4. Note 8 and 4 add up to 12, right? And so this would, as we make our grid smaller or larger, these will shrink or grow. And in fact, part of what Bootstrap's grid does for us that I was struggling a bit with Tailwind is it will kind of decide when it's time to collapse like columns into separate rows. Like we see here, we hit that breakpoint and it just collapses them for us, which is great. And one of the big pluses of the Bootstrap grid is it gives you like a mobile first design that looks good on mobile and that's responsive like straight out the bat. The other nice thing about it is we don't have to set all of these values. It will kind of figure stuff out automatically and we can just start using it. So let's go ahead and import, and let's pop up over here so we can watch this as we do it. Container from React Bootstrap. Container. And let's import row. And let's import column. And let's start making a grid. And all of these things are going to go inside my grid. So I'm going to go all the way down here. And we'll add a closed container there. We'll use the format document to make sure it's all looking nice. Let's see if I can't give myself a little bit more room. I'm going to make this just a bit smaller just so we can kind of see everything. I think what we want is we definitely want a row, and I want this Pokemon app H1 inside there. And let's put that inside a column. Now, I'm sure there's a way to center this. I think I'll come back to that piece later.
Do containers have variants like the buttons did?
Oh yeah, there's a ton of variants. Fluid is one which gives everything like complete width. By default, the containers actually added some padding and margin here. And to be totally honest, I just there's so much that the containers and the grid options have that I don't want to go through them all right now because we will get totally lost in the mix. Fluid is the big one, which we can set for different breakpoint sizes. And then row and column sizes as well. We can kind of set things for. I'm sure there's a way to like center stuff within a row or a column. I'm just not sure off the top of my head. But the defaults are pretty good because everything kind of becomes responsive. So like as we start laying this out, like let's put another row here and we'll put a column there. And inside that, let's put the Pokemon form. Frankly, all this form stuff probably is already using the grid, but we'll stick it inside a row so that the grid can handle it. And I'm not sure how much we're going to get sort of nicely for free here, but let's see as we sort of play with this responsively what happens. So a lot of this, I think, with the Bootstrap form, we already got. But we can see all this is sizing pretty nicely. Note that I haven't even done anything with the buttons and they kind of collapse down. I'm not sure if it's because it's inside the container or not. But like the buttons are a good example of somewhere where like if we wanted to start using different rows and things, we could. Um, and let's just put that inside there. And let's make one more row. And we're going to have 3 sets of columns for our buttons. So that button is going to go there inside that column. That one's going to go there inside that column. And this looks like a lot, I know. But speaking from experience, writing out like boilerplate like this, and there, in fact, we can see the rows and columns doing their thing of kind of auto sizing stuff in a flexbox way. And we can see if we look at this, we can see that there's like a consistent padding and margin on the outsides of stuff. There's a little bit of margin that's been added between layers. And we can see that these buttons have been like, well organized. And if we wanted to, we could center these. And then, of course, as we shrink this, we see that it all stays fairly responsive. And that's where starting to combine like breakpoints to say like extra small, 12, for example. Though I think we also might need to set it on the button where, in fact, it looks like we've already hit the extra small breakpoint. And in fact, I think the issue here is I need to set a value now for small and up. So we'll do 4, which is a third of our grid. And now we can see that what happens is for small and up, that button takes up 4 columns or 1/3 of the grid. And then as soon as I hit that extra small breakpoint, this button right here now takes up all 12 columns in our grid. Right? So this becomes incredibly powerful and useful. I was sort of demoing the same thing with Tailwind, but I'm a bit more familiar with the Bootstrap grid, so I think it's easier to get here fast. So I just want to pause and see what questions folks have about Bootstrap's grid, because it is a pretty interesting and powerful tool. And how are we feeling about the grid? Like relatively comfortable with it? Feel like it's a lot to take in? Where are we at?
Out of a 10, I would say a 6 for me.
Yeah, no, that's useful. And it's helpful for me to know like what are some of the sort of the challenges that you're sort of seeing when it's like, all right, I'm trying to kind of get a handle on this with the Bootstrap grid and get more comfortable with it.
I think kind of like everything else in the course, just need to like do hands-on work and like basically struggle through it until get a better understanding.
Yeah. And I mean, we haven't done a lot with breakpoints up until now, correct? Yeah, that's what I figured. So that's kind of the big thing here, this idea of breakpoints. And you sort of saw me demo it a bit less well with Tailwind, but we see it here with Bootstrap as well. And Tailwind's grid, I don't think they're using like the 12 row system. but that's why it like taking a little bit of time to read up on sort of like the grid sizing system for the tool you're using is really important. And Jason, as to your earlier point, like your layout tool is a good example of you probably want to choose one, right? Either use the Bootstrap grid or use the Tailwind utility classes for your Flexbox CSS layout. You can kind of use one inside the other. You can put grids inside grids with Bootstrap. It does get a little more complicated. But with both, the big thing is starting to think about like rows, right? And then columns. And starting to imagine that we have this invisible grid laid out here over our app. You know, I didn't give border settings to everything, but maybe I should have. And what Bootstrap's grid does is it just kind of divides everything into 12 rows, but it's also using Flexbox, which means it will shrink or grow them dynamically. And so everything is kind of organized with the same proportions, just some columns can be bigger than others. I think that's the one piece. And then the other piece is with the breakpoints, starting to think about, don't worry about the exact pixel sizes. That's less important. And you can use it to experiment, and you can experiment to kind of get a feel for it. What's important is to start thinking about the different ways that users will look at our web apps, right? Some users, like I am right now, will have a pretty wide 4K monitor. Other users might be on a laptop. Other users might be on a tablet. Other users might be on a mobile phone, right? And so the simple system of like small, medium, large, extra large, extra large is really useful to think about the different ways that stuff is displayed. And it does add more work in designing a layout. A really good rule is design for mobile first. Right? If you start off designing this way and you're using either the Bootstrap grid or Flexbox, whether with Tailwind's utility classes or not, and you get things looking nice on mobile right off the bat, it becomes very easy to make it to look nice on desktop, right? And these are all, here we go. Here's an iPad. Going from desktop to mobile is harder, right? So like a good principle is start with mobile first design, and that's probably a good goal for today. Is just to focus on that mobile first design. What other questions do folks have, or things that might be good to go over with this grid?
If you want to add CSS on top of the Bootstrap's already offered array of options, do you just add a class to that column, for example? Or is that something you don't want to do?
Great question. Great question. Let me unresponsive this. Yeah, let's say I want to add something to this H2 button right here. I would not add extra CSS right on this column. You could, it probably works. I think for simplicity, either like I kind of the same way it's nice to have like a class, like an OOP Python class that kind of has one job, a single responsibility, or a function that just does one job. I kind of like laying stuff out that way as well. To be honest, it's probably not the end of the world. Like, and actually, let's ask the internet real quick. Bootstrap, should I add custom CSS classes on layout components? Yeah, I'm not sure quite what the best practice is, but I could do we'll call it like just my column, and we'll need to put this in quotes because it's a string. And let's go here to app CSS and let's add my column. And let's just have it like border like 2px solid. Oh, blue. So that works totally fine. And it probably works fine. I think if you want to do this, there's no problem. Another way to do it, depending on what you're doing, that might offer a bit more flexibility, is you just stick a div in there. And yes, this ends up with an extra div, which can be annoying. So again, it kind of depends what it is your CSS is doing. Like if I want to outline the column, that might be the way to do it. But it can also be nice to have like a separate div that you can stick your own custom CSS onto. I think the real question is, what is the CSS doing? I'm not sure if one approach is better than the other. Does that answer your question, Tim?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and this is totally fine. And this is a great example of like if we had Tailwind installed, instead of that, I could just do like BG what was it, like Blue 500. I didn't install Tailwind in this project, so this won't work. But this is actually a great example of where Tailwind, I think, is the right tool to use, right? If it's relatively simple stuff, why make completely separate CSS classes if we can use Tailwind? And so I do think there's like good scenarios for using them together. Layout, right? Like the grid probably introduces enough complexity where you just want to use one layout tool. But like, if for some reason I want to add like a hover effect on here, Tailwind all day. Um, I really wanted to get to making like an API call to get some Pokemon data. We ran over lunch a little bit, so I do want to break for lunch. I think let me just show you all one last um, Bootstrap component, and then we can call it a day. So I am going to make a components directory here, and I am going to make a PokeCard component.
So how did you just do that? Because that doesn't seem to work on my system.
Actually with Emmet. So I'm not sure what extension I have installed. I believe Emmet is installed on VS Code by default. Yeah, it doesn't look like I have any special Emmet extensions installed. So if I type exclamation point, I start to get Emmet abbreviation options. This is maybe the missing bit. RFC stands for React Functional Component. And so like instead of say a div where if I don't know why Emmet now doesn't want to.
I think you can just type in RFC instead of the exclamation mark.
Oh, that's even better. I'm assuming this is coming from Emmet, but I'm not sure if this is Emmet or VS Code.
There's a VS Code extension.
Oh, I actually don't know what extension this is. Do you know?
It's like ES7 plus
Let's look.
React dash native snippets.
Yeah,
That top one.
yeah, there we go. I did not even realize I had this installed.
Same.
Yeah, this is a good one. So I'll throw the name in here, and you all can search for it. Thank you so much for pointing that out. I thought this was Emmett doing it. I'm putting the name in the Zoom chat now if someone wants to repost it in our Slack. Yeah, honestly, this is pretty useful. I'm sure it has like a lot more snippets with React that I don't even know about and that I'm not using. But RFC stands for React Functional Component, which is just, it's a holdover from when you could make a React component that was a class. These days, every component is a function, but it means a React component that we define as a function, which is what we do pretty much with all of them. So let me show you all quickly, and then we will break for lunch. The React Bootstrap card component, and let me make sure I get the name right here in the components list. There it is. So a card is this sort of UI concept that we've all seen. And you all can kind of see it over here. If you see where my mouse is, where it's got a title, some text, maybe there's a button and an image, right? And in fact, the button is optional. So again, I'm just going to copy the code from this basic example. As you can see, as with all things Bootstrap, there are a large number of like configuration options with a card. But again, just like there's card.link for like special styling for links. But again, the secret with Bootstrap is start simple, keep it simple, and get that working, and then you can worry about the more complex stuff. Like we're going to rip out that button. We're going to do this. I'm definitely getting rid of this image because it's using a non-existent source file. This card style, I don't really like that either. And I also don't want inline styling and stuff I don't want. And so here, our Poke card might take in, I don't know, Poke data. And just as an example, we might do something like this. Now, you all will have to change this because this should be based on what we get back from the Pokemon API. So this is fake right now. And this is also fake data. Delete when we make this real. But over here, we can have our Poke name. We can have our Poke info. And we can add a to-do note. Use card.image to show Pokemon image, right? Which we also can get from that Pokemon database. And now over here, I can import my Pokemon card. We're not doing very much interesting with it yet, but let's add in a row. Let's add in a column, and let's add in a Poke card. And actually, we'll make the Poke data be an object, Poke name, Pikachu, Poke info, but only Pokemon I know. And now, fingers crossed, So let's go back to our Explorer. Sorry, I have too many tools hiding in the corner there. Like that's also where the zoom controls are. So it's kind of, there we go. If we go back to our app, so it looks like there's something that went wrong. So let's debug it real quick and then we can wrap up. Assignment to constant variable. So it must not have liked what I did here because these are consts. I ended up faking the data elsewhere. So problem solved. Right? So we didn't get to the part where clicking submit would actually grab this and make the API call, but we did hook up the skeleton so that you could add that here and then pass that data in. And this is a nice example of how to have a reusable Pokemon card component or a card component for anything else, really, where we get a lot of nice layout from React Bootstrap. Right, and I could have, say, a list of Pokemon or multiple cards or things like that. So this is a good pattern to see. So I did want to show that before we wrapped up. And I realize we've gone long, so I very much appreciate it, folks. Why don't we break for lunch? I'll make sure that over the lunch break, I'll kind of look into like the Tailwind 4 setup, and I'll make sure it's written down how to install Tailwind, because I realized I ran into some issues there. The instructions we have in the curriculum repo work fine. They're just for Tailwind 3, which, to be totally honest, if you wanted to, you could totally use that. Today's assignment is pretty open-ended. There's a reading assignment, which is going to be a good warm-up for tomorrow. We will be looking at testing in React. And then the coding assignment is pretty open-ended. We want you to use everything you've learned with Vite and React, use effect and use state, Axios, and at least one third-party API. And you can totally use the Pokemon API if you want. Do use components and props. We would like you to use some Tailwind and some Bootstrap. So decide, which Bootstrap components you want to use and which things you want to use Tailwind for. And to have fun, because hopefully these are some tools now that you can really start to make some cool user interfaces and web apps with more interactivity. So that's really the plan for this afternoon. Thank you, folks. Have a great lunch. I'm happy to stick around if folks do have any questions. I just don't want to hold people any longer than we've already gone on. And I'll make sure to have the video and the code pushed up before lunch is over. Let me go ahead and stop the recording and open up the breakout room.